When we picture World War II, we usually think of epic battles, soldiers on the front lines, and grand military strategies. But there was another war going on, kind of in the shadows, a fight for the very soul of a continent. It was a mission to stop thousands of years of culture from just being erased. And this is the story of the very unlikely heroes who fought that war. Let's start with a number, and it's a truly staggering one: 5 million. That's the best estimate for the number of artworks and cultural treasures that were systematically plundered by the Nazis all across Europe. Now, this wasn't just random looting. Oh no. This was a calculated effort to steal the artistic heritage of entire nations. The scale of it's almost impossible to wrap your head around. So that begs the question, right? With bombs falling and armies clashing, how on earth do you protect priceless art? How do you even begin to rescue the collective memory of a continent from being totally wiped out? This was the incredible, almost impossible challenge the Allies were facing. And this is how they did it. Just look at this incredible photo. Here we see them in action, pulling one of the most famous pieces of art in history, the Ghent altarpiece, out from the dark depths of a salt mine. These were the Monuments Men, and this was their extraordinary mission. Okay, so how did all of this even get started? To really get what the Monuments Men were all about, you first have to understand that this was a totally new kind of war, one where culture itself was a primary target on the battlefield. So the official response was the creation of the Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives program. You'll hear it called the MFAA for short. It was set up in 1943, and its purpose was crystal clear: protect cultural property while the war was raging, and then, as we're about to see, hunt it all down afterward. And you have to understand, this was a totally revolutionary idea. As Lieutenant Colonel Sir Leonard Woolley points out here, no army in history had ever really made it a priority to protect the cultural treasures of its enemies. But this new idea, it had a very powerful supporter: the Allied Supreme Commander himself, Dwight D. Eisenhower. He actually ordered his forces to help the MFAA whenever and wherever they could. So if they weren't your typical soldiers, then who exactly were the people in this small, super specialized unit? Who was tasked with saving the heritage of Europe? They were, and this is no exaggeration, the art world's army. Seriously, these weren't soldiers who got retrained for some new job. These were the very people who had spent their entire lives dedicated to art and culture before the war. We're talking about museum directors, curators, brilliant art historians, and architects, all of whom basically traded in their tweed jackets for military uniforms to take on this absolutely critical mission. And this idea, it went from concept to reality fast. It all kicked off in mid-1943 when President Roosevelt created what was called the Roberts Commission. By the end of that same year, the MFAA was an official part of the Allied armies. All in all, it was a small but incredibly dedicated group, about 345 men and women from 13 different countries who would serve in this one-of-a-kind unit. Okay, so this is where we get to the heart of their story, what many have called the greatest treasure hunt in history. And let me tell you, this was no quiet academic project. This was dangerous, hands-on work happening all across a continent that was still on fire with war. I mean, these guys were often right there on the front lines. They'd roll into cities right after they were liberated to check out the damage and perform what they called first aid on art and buildings. A perfect example is the work of Monuments Officer Dean Keller in Pisa. A fire at the Campo Santo melted the lead roof, which then dripped all over these priceless 14th century frescoes, destroying them. Keller and his team rushed in, salvaged what fragments they could, and built a temporary roof to stop any more damage. Just incredible. And this work, it came at the ultimate cost. It's so important to remember these were real people in a real war. 2 Monuments officers, Captain Walter Huchhausen from the U.S. and Major Ronald Balfour from Britain, were actually killed in action while trying to secure cultural sites near the front lines in Germany. They made the ultimate sacrifice for this mission. So, as the Allies start pushing deeper into Germany, the treasure hunt kicks into high gear. And the things they found were just mind-blowing. In a salt mine in Altacia, Austria, they uncovered over 6,500 paintings, including huge masterpieces like Michelangelo's Madonna of Bruges. At the famous Neuschwanstein Castle, the one that looks like a fairy tale, they found thousands of items stolen by the ERR, which was the Nazi Special Art Looting Squad, all taken from Jewish collectors in France. The list just goes on and on. Okay, so finding all this art, that was one thing, but their mission was far from over. In fact, you could argue an even more complicated challenge was just getting started. How do you get every single piece back to where it rightfully belongs? So what was the solution? Well, it was this massive logistical operation. The Monuments Men created these things called central collecting points, or CCPs. All the art from those hidden mines and castles was trucked to these secure depots. There, every single one of the millions of items was meticulously photographed, cataloged, and conserved. Only then could the incredibly painstaking work of restitution, that is, returning it to its rightful owners, even start. And get this, there's this amazing, almost poetic piece of irony here. The biggest of all these collecting points, the one in Munich, was set up in the Führerball. That was the actual building that housed Hitler's personal office. The former nerve center of the Nazi Party was literally transformed into the headquarters for restoring the very culture that it had tried so hard to destroy. But the ethics of this whole thing, they were constantly being tested. Late in 1945, an order came down from on high to ship 202 German-owned masterpieces to the United States. In response, the director of the Wiesbaden collecting point, a man named Walter Farmer, and 35 of his colleagues signed this incredibly powerful document, the Wiesbaden Manifesto. They flat out protested, arguing that taking art, even from the enemy you just defeated, was just plain wrong. It was such a courageous stand, and it really set a whole new ethical standard for how we treat cultural property in times of war. So, after all that, what was the final impact of this incredible mission? Well, their work didn't just stop in 1946. In a lot of ways, it was really just the beginning. I mean, the legacy of the Monuments Men is just immense. When the war was over, these veterans came home and became the directors and curators of America's most famous museums. They helped create vital organizations like the National Endowment for the Arts and Humanities. And maybe most importantly, they established the international precedent that protecting culture during wartime is a moral and legal obligation. And today, the Monuments Men Foundation continues their work of finding and returning stolen art. It took a while, nearly 70 years in fact, but their service was finally recognized at the absolute highest level. In 2015, the few remaining Monuments Men were awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, and the medal itself has a quote from General Eisenhower cementing their heroic role in saving the treasures of past ages for all of us. At the end of the day, the work of the Monuments Men gave us this powerful ideal, but in a world where cultural heritage is still under threat from conflict, it leaves us with a really critical question. What is our responsibility today? How do we take their legacy and carry it forward?